Hi, Derek.
Hey, how's it going?
Not too bad, not too bad.
Good.
Oh,
Oh,
How's it going?
pretty good. What about you?
We got like a couple of like the fake springs. I don't know which one is called. So like it gets warm, then it gets cold, then it gets warm, then it gets cold again. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. That's April for us as well.
Hi guys.
Hi.
Hi.
at the moment we're in a hot phase. It's getting warmer again,
Oh, nice.
so let's hope it stays.
Yeah,
Is it
fierce.
getting hot again?
Yeah, open the window, shit. Have a look outside.
Like I went outside today and I saw my basil plant. It died. It was all right a couple of days ago. It was too cold. Okay, let me just check.
Was it your birthday coming? Balloons. That's nice.
Not really. That's just for the kids.
Well,
We
it's good
celebrate
to see
every day.
some real balloons on a Zoom call for a change, not just the fake ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add more.
Okay, it seems we are complete. Okay, then let's get it rolling. I So let me remind everyone here on the call that by attending these calls, we all agree to the spec membership agreements and the GraphQL code of conduct. And with that, let's introduce ourselves quickly in the order of the agenda. I'm Michael Stipe. I'm the host today.
I'm Camille from the guild, not the host.
Simon from Ecuador.
I'm Pascal from Chili Cream.
Martin from Apollo.
And Derek from Apollo.
Awesome. With that, we can dive directly in. I've put one topic for discussion up, and that was the one that we actually moved out of the last meeting. That is the lookup visibility or visibility in general. It's a private, internal, public, inaccessible, whatever we want to come up with.
Do we want to add package?
Right. Yeah, so Kamil came up with some concerns there. Do you remember it, Kamil?
Yeah, so basically, the default behavior right now in Federation is when you apply inaccessible directive, it actually hides the field from the public API. And I was wondering if we want to have the same, or do we want to split the behavior into two? So one will apply, the same way that Federation does, and the other one will hide fields, particular fields, maybe lookups, maybe more fields. I don't know. Maybe it might be a different directive. Doesn't really matter, but make it more selective and like hide the field instead of the fields from all the graph.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The intended semantics are a bit different in those two cases. Because with inaccessible, the reason we sort of want to mark something inaccessible in the public API, like remove something from the public API, if it has been marked inaccessible in even one of the subgraphs, is that it's a very strong requirement, basically saying I never want to see this field in the public API, and I don't want other subgraphs to accidentally expose it. But especially in the case of lookup, there's a sort of more local concern, which is like this particular lookup should only be used within a query plan to sort of resolve entities, but it should not be exposed to the public API. But that's a per subgraph concern. So you don't want, in that case, to force sort of every other subgraph to also like hide that same, or at least semantically same lookup. So I do think we want to differentiate between those two cases. My proposal was to differentiate between the existing behavior inaccessible, and because that sort of clearly indicates a more of an authentication or authorization concern, and then use something like internal for the other case.
There is also like in essence is I found what Pascal actually said, that there are like finders that are patch finders essentially, and there are finders that you want to have publicly exposed.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what kicked this discussion off.
Yeah, no,
But
definitely. Finders are a very valid part of the public API, and they're very useful for well, both for people to sort of write queries against directly, but also for clients to use to like refresh a cache or improve cache access.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of options design-wise to approach this, and I think we can eliminate half of them if we think about the concept quickly. Do we only want to apply this to finders? Is it only finders that we want to make invisible, or is it also other fields? Do we have the use case of hidden fields that are not inaccessible theoretically, but could be used for optimization in the query plan? Is there something that the context of the execution planner has to know, or
yeah, I think fields that other subgraphs require, those could also be internal. So those could be fields that are sort of fed, like they're passed through to another subgraph through require, but they're not necessarily exposed
Yes.
part of the public
Yeah.
API.
Then they kind of, it's the same thing. They visible to the execution planner, but they're not visible to the public API. So that means that
I think there's a difference, right? Because here it's about entry points. Because we don't want to have these patch lookups exposed on as an entry point. In all the other cases, I think it doesn't matter.
yeah.
I'm sorry. What do you mean by patch lookup?
I just made this to distinguish between these two. Like you have the. Oh, let's quickly draw something. It's always easier when you have some VS Code instance. All right, that's a not so good one. Okay, and it's GraphQL. So what I mean is we kind of have a query type, and on this query type we might have head by ID. Perfect. Okay, so this is the graph one. Graph. And then we might have the same thing on the graph two. And these both are lookups. Okay. This is two. So what I mean with entry point is maybe this graph owns like pet. So if I go to this graph and pet is returned, so if someone enters through this root field, then it's okay because this graph kind of can verify the entity, where this graph maybe just adds additional data, like has maybe is basically what you would describe as an extend type pet, and I know the owner, and but the owner can also be null, right? So not, you can give me ID 1, and if I don't know ID 1, I will return just null for the owner here. So I cannot verify the entity, and that's kind of a patch lookup where you.
I see what you mean. I would expect the behavior here to be that graph 2 would return null from pet by ID if it doesn't have an owner for that pet.
Exactly. But think about if both are public, right? Then you would still like you don't know the ID. What happens is that this graph would essentially give a response maybe back that is pet by ID, and then we would give owner back, which is null.
Think about how you solve it with federation.
Yeah, it's
But this case is like whenever you say, oh, it's a lookup, it's actually shareable, which means they share the context. So if you resolve pet by ID in both cases should return a pet. And if it has no owner, then the owner will be null. So you know what I mean? Like
yes, but
the pet ID is part, and the pet ID is part of the ID itself will be part of the subgraph, no? The field, I mean. So
Yeah,
Sure,
in
but
both cases,
there should be an idea over there. But I think the question here is that it's kind of like a query planner optimization, saying that hey, we never want to go to graph 2 as a root query because we know that in all cases would be pretty bad. It's always gonna go. We should always go to graph 1 and then join to graph 2 if we need to. So in that case, this is it's an optimization for the query plan, right?
Yes, it kind of is, and you need to do that because maybe your microservice owns a certain database that knows owners per pets, but it doesn't know all the pets. So returning this here would be wrong maybe for pet 1 because pet 1 doesn't exist, and that's why you first have to go to graph 1, which knows all the pets. And after that, you can patch in. That's basically what internal lookups do. They patch. They're not owning the identity of the entity. They can provide extra data.
What if we just we discussed this before, but just to also put this up for discussion. One alternative approach to internal and public and whatever of lookups could also be ownership, right? You could say in graph 1 it owns pet. And
yeah, I mean we used to have ownership in Federation 1 and we removed it in Federation 2 because it was too restrictive for people. You're right that in some cases a particular subgraph owns an entity, but that turns out to be a very hard to, like, it's not a concept that always applies, and it makes migration very difficult.
Did you have the restriction that an entity can only be owned by one subgraph?
Yes, that was the restriction at that point. Yeah.
Because if
But
ownership
what you would do?
so greedy,
but-
right? You can have it on two.
Yeah, because here you could really have, because if you leave empty, what internal does is basically defining ownership of a certain key to an entity. So you can resolve this entity, or you can make sure if I give you this key set, and you give me something back, that the entity for this key is verified, kind of. So it's kind of like an ownership, what we do here, this optimization. Because these two maybe own this entity. So they know if you give me an ID, I can give you the object back.
Yeah.
And if I give you the object back, it exists. And all the others can just patch in data.
Yeah.
That is in essence what underscore entities does. It's a patch resolver. Like it's a generic patch resolver, what Apollo Federation.
Yeah, I mean, we have a distinction between the underscore entities and the real finder or the real lookup, so to speak. But here we have to make that distinction explicitly within the lookup methods themselves. I mean, this makes a lot of sense to me. I'm just wondering how hard it will be to explain this to people, and whether that combination of lookup and internal
Yes, that's why
makes sense
maybe
for people there.
we wanna make that we could also make that explicit.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
maybe
just-
maybe there's another term that works there. I mean, patch doesn't really do it for me, but
if you have something else, I share your concern, because this kind of, why do I have to do that? It has no like the semantic is not clear here. What does this directive do? So I would prefer to have one directive. It could also be merge or I don't know. But if we find one term that we could have here,
Yeah, there's one.
it could also be sorry.
Or an argument to look up, like similar to the resolvable argument we currently have on key.
Do you have a suggestion, Patchable?
I mean, something, yeah, like partial or I think that was Derek's suggestion for partial lookup, but maybe that works as an argument as well.
I mean, but one second. I mean,
a false in this case.
Graph,
Yeah.
graph
Or
one,
no, it is true. Yeah.
graph 1 and graph 2 also are partial lookups. Because they look up the owner.
Yeah, so the distinction for me is that these graphs essentially can verify the identity of an object. So you give a key in, and they can say, okay, for this key, an object exists. That is essentially what it does. And in the microservice architecture, you have often these patterns where like a service owns a certain data source or owns a certain part of data.
I would say this is the default. You rarely have data which is present in two systems. I mean, all of it. Parts, yes, but all of it. Like a product catalog for a web shop. Or a user, you have the user service which owns user. You rarely sync all the users all the time to a different database that stores the profile, right? It rarely happens.
I think at an entity level it does happen. Like a type like product, for instance, it's like different aspects of products are spread out over different systems.
I agree. But isn't there a central product catalog that has all the entities? Because otherwise it doesn't work anyway. You need to have somewhere to page through.
In some cases, there's a single service that's responsible, but it doesn't have to be. Like the entity key can actually lead you into different systems. And I think at this point, like it really is an optimization. Like you can always in parallel call lookups in different systems if you request fields from different systems. Like if you request the owner and the name and the
yeah, the problem is more that if you only request owner, you have inconsistency in data.
Yeah, that's true.
Derek has a hand up. So
yeah, so my comment is more of a generic answer. If we find it very confusing to actually what that means and how it actually should be represented and what it actually how it should behave, then the question is how confusing it's gonna be to folks to use that. And if it's very confusing to folks, because it sounds like for us it's pretty confusing, I would say maybe we should just drop the concept and saying that this is actually not, we're not gonna do that. So like if it's a lookup, it has to be a shared stuff. You cannot do inaccessible or internal on lookups.
But that would
that
make it
solve the
unviable.
issue.
Yeah. I think that we cannot explain it now because we are just in the finding phase. It's always like we haven't found yet a good distinction for what this is. I think I could already explain very well what the distinction here is. Like it's for me, while you can break it down to an optimization, it also has to do something with ownership of
it's
of an
semantics.
entity.
That's different.
Yeah, that's true.
And I would even go as far as say, I'm not sure if it should be at lookup with an argument, because I would say then if we talk about ownership, I think it's a wrong thing to have it on the resolver on the lookup itself. We have different approaches that we have to think about. First of all, do we need an at internal also for required? If so, then we cannot use an argument, or we cannot use a different patch, a different name like patch, because then it's a concept that would be shared between normal fields and lookup fields. Then we cannot use something in place of the lookup field or in the lookup field's arguments to point to that this is a special.
Well, I think there are different issues though, because internal means that it's not exposed to the public API. But this distinction applies even internally, I think. Like if you have an internal relationship to a pet, and at that point in the query, someone goes from like customer to pet and then to owner, you run into the same issue. You still need to make that distinction.
It's more about the same optimization there, that you want to say that the field, I don't know, name of pet has always to be resolved from one resolver, but we have a kind of internal in another service, and this can be used in optimizations for the query.
And I think one thing here is like we shouldn't have two internals. That's my gut feeling. This would be difficult. Yeah, and I think the semantics, that Apollo has with inaccessible is pretty good. Like if you're deeper in the graph, why do you want make something inaccessible on one graph? That's more about traffic steering then, which is a different concept.
Yeah, it's also weird. It's very weird.
Are you saying the combination of lookup and internal does make sense to differentiate between these two cases?
No, I think the path that we are now on is not to say, like, to specify what kind of lookup that is better than having to explain people you need to make that internal here, this guy, to have these semantics. I think that then we have two technical things that we explain to get to a semantical
So it would be, so like if you apply here at internal, right, or inaccessible, then you have a different behavior of inaccessible when it's deployed on different levels, which I think is confusing, right?
That's
Yeah.
very bad.
I think, well, another question is, would we ever want to allow a partial lookup to be exposed to the public API? Like if the other graphs did not expose pet by ID and we just had a pet by ID that's partial, I don't think we would want to allow that to be exposed to the public API. So in that case, the combination with the internal does start to make sense again.
Yes, but I think the semantic, like, you mean that in some cases you want to expose it publicly, or?
No, the opposite. What I want to say is that we actually want to prohibit exposing a partial lookup as part of the public API.
Yes.
So,
Yes, but it's like, if you think about this, like this is the merged schema here will have one pet by ID. So for the user, it's not observable.
No, but what I mean is if graph 1 and graph 2 did not have pet by ID in it, and we just had graph 3, without internal there, you would expect pet by ID to be exposed to the public API, but we don't want that.
what?
Why would you say that if it's not only meant for patching, like if it's only, then it cannot be on the public graph, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. So in this case, the internal is sort of implicit because the argument is true, and that seems confusing. I mean, that sort of, in that case, the combination of lookup and internal may make more sense because you sort of get the internal behavior for free there. Internal works the same everywhere.
Yeah, also if we have like partial and not partial, then there's like, I don't know, to me it's kind of weird to even have that, to be honest. I think we should, because there's a case where you want to like hide it completely. And I think like you could have, I would say that like mixing
in which case would
like,
you hide it?
Yeah, I'll explain.
Completely.
So if you want to have, let's say you do I don't know, a migration, right? And you have like a bunch of pet by IDs in different subsets, right? And you have an owner or like this partial false and true, right? So then you're kind of in a state where you have only partials, you know? So then those should be hidden by default. If there's 100 of them, doesn't really matter, right? So I'm thinking like if we should, because maybe exposing, like having a lookup hidden by default is actually a good option. And then if you want to expose it, then yeah, you expose it. And then you actually say, you know, which one do you want to expose? Then it will, every time you make a request, it will only get to those. So it's like, for example, in Apollo, you have everything hidden by default, right? All the entities are like meta false, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's really a better default than what we have now with lookups, because then you have to hide all of those. And there's a chance that you might not want to have pet by ID in the public schema, right? Because I don't know, you don't want user to fetch, I don't know, an invoice by ID. It has to be in some context of like me or, you know, this kind of stuff. And those entities, there's like a lot of them. Like the schemas I've seen, there's a lot of, you know, a lot of entities and little entry points for those directly by the key, like ID or like, you know, this kind of stuff. So I'm thinking like if we should like step back a bit and like maybe do it, hide it by default and expose it on demand, but I'm not quite sure. Just a thought.
In this case, go ahead, Derek.
There's also like another use case though. So let's say we do have pet by secret ID, right? and we mark it as a lookup, but all of those, as you were talking about, like maybe we have 100 subgraphs that actually have this entry point by some secret ID that's private ID that should not be exposed. So that ID would be inaccessible, right? So like if we mark it as inaccessible or internal, then I would imagine that should never be part of a public API, right? And I kind of well, I kind of like the explicit, opt-in to public kind of thing.
Yeah.
Versus like hiding it. So like so then you make an effort to say, hey, this is actually going to be public. It still has a consequence. Okay, what if you make it a public in a inaccessible or internal, or then the kind of like composition error, I guess you'd tell them this is not applicable. But yeah.
Like if we go for something like public,
not even
then
public, it could be as lookup.
Yes, but I have two examples here.
Because it will only apply to a lookup.
Oh, but we can say public false for internal.
What?
You can say, no, the scope is different now. I see.
So I would like the thing I like about public here is that it would be clear what inaccessible or internal does. Like we don't bring like what is very weird if this does something different on different things.
Yes.
And this would now be very clear. But if you introduce public and you put it on something that is internal on another graph, would it introduce it then on this side? Could you like per graph then opt out of the internal?
Half of the
I
time
think that was the idea. That was the idea behind the distinction between inaccessible and internal, is sort of that internal would be per subgraph.
Also, the way we at the moment describe is that internal makes everything internal, right? Like inaccessible at the moment. But if you introduce then something like public, and you go on the second graph and say bar here is public, would this opt out of the internal for one graph?
No, I would say that internal is per subgraph anyway. But
what sense would it make?
So Michael, so maybe it's a lookup with a parameter, right? So public false by default, and you have to change it public true to make it.
This one here.
Yeah, something like this. Yeah.
I'm just brainstorming, right? So
we can also
we
could also, the one thing is pet by ID. Is pet by ID a lookup in the first graph?
It is, I think.
Or is it, it's an entry point and it just happens to be a lookup as well?
Well, I mean, and lookups are entry points, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, but from the public graph, you could have, if you copy pet by ID and you just rename it as, I don't know, favorite pet by ID or something like this, one could be exposed in the graph and one could be the lookup. It could be the same thing, but it could also be not the same thing. And it just happens to be the same thing in this case, that it's the thing we want to show to the user, but it's also the thing that we want to use as the lookup field.
I would really like to make lookup a concept that also applies to the public API, so it's accessible to clients. Like the concept of a lookup method is very useful for clients as well.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it could be two concepts that just happen to be the same thing in this case. It's a lookup, but it's also exposed. So lookup and public could actually mean it could indicate two completely different things. And that's the reason why two directives could make a lot of sense. Because one could be that we expose it publicly, and the other could be that it is a lookup. Because there are fields that you can expose which are not lookups on the
that makes a lot of sense to me. But public in that case means exposing the whole field to the public API, including like the lookup directive, like the fact that it's a lookup.
If the rule would be just one thought, right? If the rule would be something like all the root types, all the fields of the root types are hidden by default. And then you say that these are lookups, but that doesn't make them public. And also the me field would be public. Only when you specify public, the field would be public. And then two directives would make a lot of sense, because in this case, pet by ID is a lookup, but it's also public.
But making all root fields non-public by default, that's a pretty big change, and that would require a pretty big migration.
That's a big breaking change to the behavior.
Yeah.
I wouldn't also like it. I like typically when you put something on the root field, I get, sorry if Cameron, you have the hand up for a longer time.
Yeah, just wanted to add that the idea of having a lookup is actually to contribute to a type, contribute to an entity, and this contribution is actually like internal, like it's, you know, developer adding a field to whatever type, right? So this, and the fact that we have those lookups like pet by ID on the root is only because kind of from like, because of the limitation of GraphQL.js and the way we want to do it, which is like, you have to have an entry point to allow for, you know, whatever resource to be resolved based on some requirement, right? Just to not break the schema, just to not provide some meta APIs and stuff like that, right? So to me, having the lookup hidden by default is actually a good default, because it's like, it's only meant to contribute to a field. It's not meant to be used. It can be meant to be used, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
It's just that it could, and you can have like pet, user, invoice, whatever, and it's not really like when you write a GraphQL, you write it for public consumption, right? You write it for one client, you write it for like mobile apps, doesn't really matter, but you shape it in a way that is like easily accessible for the consumer, right? And when you have pet by ID, yeah, it's nice, but it doesn't really mean that people that write the GraphQL, they want to have such thing in their public API, right? If they don't want to, then they have to hide every single element, and every team is actually in charge of, is it, you know, will it be exposed or not? And for example, you can have one team that has a lookup because they want to contribute a pet by ID, and then they want to have like I don't know, a score, or like, you know, did I feed it or not, right? So then you introduce a lookup, and bang, you all expose the direct access to the pet, right? And it's not by mistake, like it's actually more not secure, but like it from like the team's perspective, like all the teams that build GraphQL API, it's actually easier to detect a breaking change than an addition, right? There's like a lot of additions, it will be gone. If it's like a breaking change, let's say you had a pet by ID public and now somebody added something and it's hidden, boom, it's like easier to spot, right? Because there are less breaking changes than additions. So for me, it just makes more sense, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's also what you want, Martin, right? Because you want the public lookups for the client. If you think for the client use case concept, there you want the public lookup, and that is actually can resolve the entity, the identity of the entity, or kind of verify that. Whereas the internal lookups are, kind of patchers that can provide additional data. But it's not guaranteed that if you pass in something that does not exist, that they respond in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Yeah, and Camille's concerns make a lot of sense to me. I think what I'm what I'm not sure about yet is like if we make the default of lookup to be non-public, then that's sort of a weird exception to the semantic of other root fields. Means that if you like have an existing field and you mark it lookup, it suddenly disappears from the public API. So that's
we could also split it into two distinctive directives. Like
no, I don't think that would help, right?
Why? Because
it's about what the default is for a lookup. Like for any other field, the default is for it to be public, and you have to mark it
You're
internal
right.
explicitly.
Yeah.
But for lookup, it would be the other way around, and I think that is a little bit confusing.
What do you have more if you think about your federation use cases? Do you have more public fields in a subgraph, or do you have more entities that you have key attributes? Because an entity times the keys is what we would have in Fusion. So when you have on an entity, when you have a subgraph, which, for example, in this case, resolve pet by ID. If this is on subgraph 3, then there will be a pet by ID resolver. If you have a subgraph which has pet by ID as a key, and then another key would be, I don't know, name and identification, or name and owner, something like this. And if you have name and owner, because usually people don't name their pets the same, then this would be another patch resolver. It would be another lookup which is hidden. And now when you think about your federation history, right, what do you have more? Does a subgraph expose, it's more likely to expose something that is an addition to the whole supergraph? Or is it more likely that it adds a field into the query root?
I'm not sure what the balance is, but I think both use cases are pretty common, and I would expect that to differ between graphs. Maybe also depending on sort of how people think about ownership, and that also differs by organization.
Yeah, I mean,
like
ownership would be something completely different, right? You could say
but what I'm saying is that would be one of the underlying reasons for that difference.
Yeah, so if someone is a heavy user of Relay, then you know it's everywhere is IDs, right? Everything is like that. It's if someone's not using Relay much, then it really varies, I guess. But yeah.
So I'm going to write something up, like with all the things that we discussed. So we have kind of a document like for the pass syntax, and then we should reflect a bit more on that. We won't find a solution today on this, but it's good.
No, but I think we had a good discussion. We've had a few good concerns that
I would also like to add something to this document, which we haven't really had an example here, which would be shared ownership, because I think that would also solve the problem quite neatly. By default, all the entities have a shared ownership, and if one subgraph claims the ownership of a type, then all the other finders are patch resolvers. And if a second subgraph wants to also claim ownership, then it's just shared ownership. So by default, all the finders are public. If a subgraph says this is actually my type, then the others go internal, and then you have it because the terminology that we use is ownership internally. So maybe that's something that we can also, it makes it easier to explain.
Yeah, but Pascal, what I would have a problem with is like if you say pet is my type, and then we implicitly make the lookups public, or I think ownership is not about visibility here, because you could also be both, right? Like graph 3, maybe it's not the maybe has no ownership over ID, but might very well have the ownership of another key. Like I think it's not about ownership, it's about, can I verify that this ID is correct? So can I look this up for this ID, and if I can look it up by this ID, I know this type exists.
It's per key. You're right, it's per key.
Yeah.
And that's why it should be on the lookup. And that's also a good. It's not about ownership of the type.
I'm really in the group for public for finder and patch, because in Apollo Federation it's two completely different concepts, which are also really hard to explain to people how they work. You have underscore entities, you have the public fields. It's a concept, the entities concept, the patch. These are the patch resolvers that you have, and it's two different things. A public field is not a patch resolver, right?
I think my only concern there is that it changes the default, like it's like compared to other query root fields. Instead of a field being public by default and then marking it internal, you're now saying everything that's marked lookup is internal by default, and we have another directive public that makes it public. And I think
it could also be that lookup is by default public, and patch, or whatever name we find, does make it internal.
Yeah,
it's just,
I think that's one of the options we have here, right?
Semantically, these are two different things, and I wonder if it makes sense to use the same terminology for it and just have an attribute which actually say that it's something completely different. Because one talks about having an entity that's publicly resolvable through, and the other one is, I just want to add something to this entity. I don't need to know if this entity even exists. I only add something to the entity. And these are very different concepts.
Yeah, I think we need to write that down, and like the different sorts on that, and then we make a big table with a couple of variants that could work out, and then people can add to that table, and then we can find over a couple of weeks probably a good solution.
Yeah.
I think next week is the big one, right? Is it next week?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
I think I can probably make progress on the path spec. Pretty swamped this week, but I can probably make some progress on the path spec, and then we can have a discussion in the public work group about it. And we can probably also have a discussion about this with the document, based on the document, just so that we have everyone looped in, because these are the two big things that we're at the moment working on, right? It does make sense to talk about both in the public work group.
Oh.
I mean, this one is also public, but in the major one, the big one.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. It was a great discussion. I think everybody has now an idea of the problem. And if you come up with it, just post it in the Slack channel, or I will have after the weekend the document.
Yeah, if you're
And then we
solved,
can-
just make a pull request.
I don't think I can.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, what's great that we can, if nobody else has something, we can make it a early weekend.
Very early weekend. Well, that sounds good.
Okay.
All right.
See you guys.
Well, thank you so much.
Bye.